no doubt, considering my spoiling tendencies, by tomorrow there will be a blue post from Blizzard announcing balance tuning changes for tier sets, and all of these tier sets will be buffed.
Well, you can't really say you haven't been warned a couple of days ago, because what is happening right on this reset, on this third week of Season 4, is balance tuning, the first of the season, hitting a few specs with some interesting changes. So we are starting straight up from what supposedly should be the biggest of the changes, but unfortunately, I'm afraid, is going to be a big nothing burger, are the nerfs to Vengeance Demon Hunter. So, for a long time, we have pointed out that the dominance that Vengeance Demon Hunter started in Season 3 was due to their double use of Sigil, mostly thanks to this talent over here, Illuminated Sigils, which gave them unparalleled control over packs of mobs. It's the only tank that can do this sort of thing, getting gigantically large pools and then rotate multiple sets of crowd controls, double rounds of 5-second long silences, double rounds of chains to also serve as an interrupt for mobs, double rounds of fear to also once more interrupt mobs. Don't forget the AoE stun is still part of their toolkit, and that allows you to keep 20 plus mobs locked down for long enough for your turbo AoE specs to do enough damage. So Blizzard comes in and, at the very least, as a positive to start, do acknowledge that the main problem of Vengeance is the Sigil, and in particular the Silence Sigil. However, the nerfs are just not nearly enough. 1 second shorter silence duration from 5 to 4 seconds, 30 seconds longer cooldown from 60 to 90 seconds, and then also less cooldown reduction from cycling your sigils from 3 to 2 seconds every time one of your sigil triggers. The soul cleave damage is completely irrelevant. Soul cleave is barely 5% of your overall damage as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. This is still very likely not really going to change anything when it comes to tanks. The ability for you to cycle your double rounds of sigils whenever you have your big cooldowns of your DPS to be able to have these massive pools in Mythic Plus is remaining rather unchanged. You might have to skip on the third sigil now on a big pool as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, but you are still far ahead of what every other tank can do. You know, this is your run-of-the-mill Mythic Plus key where you are, timing big cooldowns around very large trash pools. And you can see that if we were to use the post-nerf version of the Sigil of Silence, so instead of having 2 sigils coming back in 2 minutes, because they have a 1 minute cooldown to their charge, now they have a 90-second cooldown, so it comes back every 3 minutes. You can see that you can still cycle double silence sigils in pretty much every single large DPS pool. So whether the sigil had a 1 minute cooldown or a 90-second cooldown, you can still pull off these pools exactly as you were before. Don't forget also that the other sigils were basically untouched. Yes, the minor nerf of the cooldown reduction, now they have a 7 to 9 second longer cooldown compared to before, but it is still nothing. At the end of the day, the most important thing isn't how weaker you get, but rather, is any other tank becoming stronger than you once you get nerfed? And the answer for Vengeance Demon Hunter is no. So all these nerfs are irrelevant to the power of Vengeance. Talking about something slightly more relevant, it's Balance Druid. One of the focuses of our video about the terrible tier sets in this season, which were practically a DPS loss for Balance Druid, this is being addressed in these changes. Now, the 2-piece set bonus is back to having their original damage. The 2-piece set bonus is meh. Your generators account for very little of your damage, so this buff is rather irrelevant, going back to the original 50% stuck-in damage the tier set had when it was released. What really matters is the 4-piece. The bonus damage on the first spender when you enter Eclipse going up to 60% more damage, and also the discount going up to 30 astral power instead of 15. It's not quite like the original, because the original was free rather than 30, but it's almost now back to that level. And this one is a much more relevant buff for Balance Druid. You can see here the pre-buff sim versus the post-buff sim of Balance Druid. It's about a 6-ish to 7% damage buff to to Balanced Druid, and this is in single target. It's similar, slightly higher even in AoE for balance. This is a significant buff because as a Balanced Druid you do enter Eclipse very often, and this is going to account for every time you do enter Eclipse, and you get this discount of astral power for your spender. So you do get to have quite a lot of discounts over the course of a boss fight, or even more over the course of a Mythic Plus, you know, big large pool of trash mobs. That is why it is a relevant damage increase, and also it solves now the annoyance of having to keep your older tier. Now pretty much at all item levels your new Season 4 tier set will be an upgrade over your older tier set for Balanced Druid. After Balance you have the head-scratching change of the patch, which is damage nerfs to Brewmaster. So this comes at an upside, which is the upside of getting more magical damage tankiness due to the stagger now being more effective against magical attacks. This comes, however, at the cost of having a bunch of your damage nerfed. In particular, Keg Smash, and even more in particular, Summon White Tiger Statue. Spinning Crane Kick is whatever, it's just a meme, doesn't really matter. What mattered more is Keg Smash for your overall damage, and more importantly, your Summon White Tiger Statue for your burst damage. Brewmaster doing burst can easily get to 400,000 DPS as a tank, also thanks to, as far as burst is concerned, your White Tiger Statue. And yes, if we want to be picky, technically Brewmaster had the strongest, highest damage in Mythic Plus, even if Vengeance was, you know, tying with Brewmaster. Don't forget that pretty much all of the top tanks right now are playing Vengeance. So if you were to take some of the hundreds of very good Vengeance tanks that also can play Brewmaster and put them on Brewmaster, they would spike up the average damage of Brewmaster by a lot. So even in this unplayed state, Brewmaster was doing top damage. So yes, the damage was too high, however, it's kind of weird to see them nerfed in damage given that right now they are not a very popular spec. On to, this time, a much more straightforward buff. This one is to Assassination. Flat out, all attack damage and abilities are buffed by 6% in damage. This is weird and also sad, because this is essentially the revert of the nerfs that Assassination received in the first weeks of Season 3. In the first weeks of Season 3, something weird was going down, and it wasn't even Assassination's fault. It was mostly just the hooks of augmentation being faulty and giving way more damage to Assassination Rogues, together with Caustic Spittle, the new addition to Assassination, being wonky in terms of damage being registered, giving Assassination just an overall quite high damage. And after the nerfs, of course, Assassination started going further and further down throughout Season 3. Even in Mythic Plus, they are so poor and underplayed right now, they are struggling to clear 12 keys, because most players are playing Outlaw right now in Mythic Plus. In the raid, they have been one of the weakest overall performers. So if we are to give Assassination this 6% damage increase, this is where they would be ending up right now, with 6% more damage, which is also a testament, right, to the balance of the game right now, where a 6% damage buff can bring you in the top half from being at the absolute bottom when it comes to Assassination. Not much hope, of course, for them becoming more relevant in Mythic Plus just because of a 6% damage buff. After Assassination, you have the duality of buffs between Affliction and Destruction. Of course, there is confusion around the buffs given to Destruction, given that we just had a video about Destruction being the best spec in Mythic Plus. And they get a single target buff. 3% damage to Chaos Bolt and then 5% to Conflagrate and Incinerate. This is even weirder when you consider Destruction's single target damage isn't even that weak, at the very least, compared to Demo and Affliction. Or actually, sorry, I should say, all three of them are weak. It's not that Destruction is any weaker, they have a bit more of a downside in having to move. They are a bit more of a turret DPS spec than the other two Warlock specs. It is still quite weird though to see damage increases for Destruction for single target, especially when you are ignoring the other two Warlock specs. If you were to acknowledge Destro was in need of buffs, then what about the other two, from Demo to Affliction? at least Affliction is getting buffs. Doom Blossom, Vile Taint, Soul Flame and Soul Rot are all receiving buffs, which has nothing to do with the single target we just mentioned. It is mostly for AoE damage. But even then, with the AoE damage in mind and the single target damage in mind, it's not that big of a deal, right? These are the increases of Affliction for single target and for AoE. We're talking about a 1.5% single target damage increase, 3% at best AoE damage increase for Affliction. So we are talking about some very slight increases for the spec. The last of the DPS specs being buffed is Fury, which was the other spec we were mentioning in the broken tier sets video about Fury's tier sets actually being a DPS loss. Now this gets adjusted. Now the rampage damage and crit from the 2 pieces up to 15% instead of 12, and also the damage increase of Bloodthirst of the 4 piece goes up, together with flat out 3% more ability damage. This is again making the new tier set of Fury be at the very least a very slight net positive over the old one, which is still a bad thing, because if you're gaining 30 plus item levels as you are replacing your tier set, you would be expecting some 8-10% damage increase just out of the item level alone, which is not still what Fury is getting. So even after these buffs, the tier is still quite weak. At least now it's not a DPS loss to go up by 10 item levels overall on your gear if you're switching to this season's tier set. There is still the problem of Fury, of course, that even after this buff you have to look at your competitor, which in this case is the other spec in your class, which is Arms. And the problem is that at the moment Arms is still at a comfortable 6 to 7% more damage than Fury. So even after this set of buffs, Arms is the better spec overall for Warrior. So cool that now you can use your 4 piece of this new season. Not that cool that the buffs were still quite small overall for Fury. The last of the buffs, surprisingly, go to a tank, and that's Protection Warrior. Blizzard lets out a note pointing out the weaknesses of Protection Warrior they are attempting to fix, mentioning they are taking away some of the power from a single talent, Battering Ram, and spreading the power increase to basically your default tools. So you're gaining 5% more ability damage, 30% more devastator damage, 6% more healing from Ignore Pain, lower CDR to your version, your shitty version of your Sigil of Silence. Now it's a 75-second cooldown, except a Vengeance Demon Hunter has a 90-second cooldown version of this that can be reduced down to an 80-second cooldown, and you have 2 charges of it. So this Disrupting Shout is still far worse than what a Vengeance Demon Hunter has, and then more importantly, more baseline tankiness. You now get more stamina and armor as well as more haste by default as a Protection Warrior. As we mentioned at the start, talking about Vengeance, the nerfs to Vengeance were not nearly enough to make them any weaker compared to the other tanks. Same goes for Protection Warrior. It's not that these buffs are going to skyrocket Prot Warrior into being a top tier tank. So basically, no, you don't have to Flavor of the Month reroll to Protection Warrior, but at the very least, everyone who was already playing Protection Warrior, now they get to have a smoother time enjoying the spec. So it is still a positive. Now, of course, once this balance tuning round goes live, some players will be left with questions. After all, the video we made about broken tier sets, yes, had Fury, which was buffed, yes, had Balance, which was buffed, but it also had Survival, which was left out from this. We also had something we didn't mention, Blood Decay, which also has a broken tier set which is not being utilized right now by DK players. Yet these seem to have gone by the set of nerfs for this balance tuning. We also had some questions about perhaps some nerfs to Shadow Priest, if we are talking about high level keys with long, large pulls regarding their AoE damage together with Destro, or even nerfs to Red Paladin when it comes to the more average level keys and more short-lived pulls when it comes to burst AoE for the spec. However, unfortunately, this is as far as we go in terms of balance tuning, hoping, of course, that this won't be the last of the tuning for the entire season. these were the main focuses Blizzard had for the first round of tuning after a couple of weeks in the season. So for today, at the beginning of the third reset, I guess, in NA of this Season 4, we are now leaving each other on this Tuesday. We are starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, man, what a horror movie. I was recording a video while simultaneously waiting for a delivery, being on my toes to hear the bell ring. Well, nothing so far.